Hi, I'm iKia, and for today's video I want to give an in-depth guide into my multi-calculators. These are those DPS calculators that you may have seen in my in-depth looks and in my build showcases and such, as I do use them quite a bit, where we can have multiple builds, and especially as well together with weapons and such, against each other so we can compare and contrast, as I feel that is the important thing to use things like DPS or even time to kill or any other metric for, because a metric by itself isn't that useful until we can compare it to what else could we have. And that has always been the goal of these. Quite recently, I already had added in a headhunter and a skill damage calculator as well into the pool. And now as well, I've given all of them a little bit of a facelift and given them a little bit of a new look and some slight new functionality. So yeah, I want to introduce you to that and then also show how to fill these in for people that aren't me and don't know how these work exactly. To somebody that already kind of understands the damage calculations and such, it shouldn't be too much of a stretch to understand these just by looking at them. But that's of course not a given, but I can just show you exactly what you can take from the game, input it into these calculators and make use of them. And in doing so, hopefully teach more people to use DPS calculations, as they are a very, very useful tool. Everything will be timestamped down below as we'll jump around. I'll try to keep it brief. I don't want to make this too in-depth of a guide. We'll just briefly show actually each of the calculators, how to fill them in and how to make use of them. And also what to look out for, especially when filling them in, and also with the metrics that you get out of it. So yeah, let's go get started. And let's do that by going into the folder in which all of these multi-calculators exist. It is especially the files we'll be discussing today: the 2.0 DPS Compare Multicalc, the 3.0 Headhunter Compare Multicalc, and the 4.0 Skill Compare Multicalc. We'll also touch on this 5.0 Quick Calc, which has a bunch of quick calculations that you can do with it. What we won't be covering today is the Division 1 DPS Compare. That already actually has its own separate video, which you can go look up. It's a rambling-ish talk. So in this one, I'm going to try to keep it a little bit more on tracks. And also, we won't be covering the weapon talent calculators in both the normal version and the perfect talent version. Those also already have their own video, and they are, of course, about one build. We input one build, and then we get the talents out and how much damage each talent would add in a theoretical sense. Those are already covered, and I'll link to that video. So especially today, we'll be looking at the multi-calculators themselves, and we'll start doing so by looking at these new and improved slightly multi-calculators. So we'll start here with the DPS one, where, for instance, I have added in a damage per mag, which, yeah, actually I should have done much earlier. And also, for instance, a multiplier calculator there. For the rest of it as well, we've added in a rate, and in a clearer way than, for instance, I have in my build showcases and such, as we can just put that number in here separately and just have that affect all of these numbers without as well affecting actually the numbers coming out of our hit calculation. And all of these files work in the same way if you want to use them, which is that you have to actually copy them to your own drive or download them. So from my understanding, this works perfectly fine. For instance, if you have Excel at home, you can just do File, Download, and then as a Microsoft Excel file. And the functionality of this is so simple that, yeah, it'll just carry over and will work perfectly fine. You can also make a copy if you have your own Google Drive, and most of us will do. And if you don't as well, you can sign up for free for one. So yeah, you can make a copy. When you do, it basically prompts you to where you want to save one, and then it will save one there. You do need it to be on your own Google Drive to fill it in, because of course, if you try to fill one in somebody else's Google Drive like mine, you wouldn't be able to, and numbers just won't, you can't input any numbers there. So you do need to copy them to a place where you can have edit access, and then you can edit them. Then if we also look at the Headhunter one, and the Headhunter one already I had and used for a few. I added then a little bit of functionality to it with some checkboxes and such, also adding in a third shot for the places where that may be relevant, because sometimes a third shot does need to be accounted for before we reach the cap shot. So in here, we're kind of doing that. Also for Hunter's Fury is a little bit weird with headhunting. So we have our own section for that in the corner, which I'll touch on when we get there. And then the skill damage calculator, where we can do basically the same thing of inputting skills into here. This also coincides then with having added into the burst and sustain tables, actually adding the base values for all of the skills and such, and some of their metrics that we would need to kind of input it into here. Also, for things like the turret and drone, I've made basically a toggle where we can actually calculate out their DPS and such. That's mostly just for the turret and drone, and we'll touch on that when we actually reach it there. But yeah, again, for usage of these, you need to copy them to your own Google Drive or download a version of it that you can, for instance, run with Excel or maybe LibreOffice or something else. And in doing so, you can then edit them and fill them in. So let's now go show how to fill each of these ones in. And let's start that by looking at the DPS calculator, as we'll especially here explain the base layout of all of these, where input happens down here, and basically anywhere where it is yellow, you can input stuff there. That's the designed places to input them. Now, of course, for some of the things like RPM and stuff, you can actually fill them in separately here, and sometimes you will have to if you have different weapons or such. But especially the yellow places are where input should be done, definitely, basically. And that can cascade through, for instance, as well, where the RPM is here. If we input an RPM, that goes through all of that, basically inputs it into all of the other fields. Then we can also still alter them in here, of course. What we're especially getting out of these is at least the DPS one, is a mag damage calculation, a burst DPS calculation, and then a sustain DPS calculation, and then all of the percentages differences between those. Everything is always comparing to the top slot, so you always start at the top and work your way to the bottom, and that is how you can compare them percentage-wise. That's how it's set up. So the basic build you put there, and then the builds you want to compare and see if you gain or lose some damage, that's the other slots. Then what we also get out is in this DPS calculator, at least, a body shot plus crit, and a headshot plus crit numbers. And especially now that I've separated out the rate basically into its own separate number out here, we do get the numbers out of here, even though if we set a different rate here, which actually is a very handy thing of these new ones. And that was one of my annoyances with my old ones, where if I input a rate in the way I was doing in the past, that would actually break these numbers, so you had to watch out for that. But now we get basically checking numbers. That's what this whole section is about in the DPS calculator, where if we do a body shot in the game, it should line up pretty closely. With a lot of weapons, it won't be perfect. You might be a little bit off, a digit or two, and that is completely normal because we don't have perfect base damage numbers for all of the weapons. So we're off by a little bit from the very start, and that cascades through the numbers. If you're off by usually more than a single digit, something is going weird, unless you're dealing with a build that is adding dozens of multipliers and it's just getting, But anything over 100, we're not, that shouldn't happen, ever. But a digit off or such, that is quite common, and that is down to that base value not being perfectly known for all of the weapons. Then also we have some toggles here. You'll see several toggles being added. These are actually underlying, they're just a 0 and a 1. Here, for instance, we can activate or deactivate DTOC by just toggling this, and that will actually change the numbers up here. So for instance, especially for DTH and DTA, you should only have one active at a time, because if you can just toggle both on. I'm not stopping you per se from doing so, just to keep this simple. But I'll expect that anybody that is interested enough in DPS calculation knows that only one can be active at a time, so do so. Or even, for instance, you can deactivate both of them. But if you're, for instance, shooting an AR, you should have DTH active if you're shooting a target that has health active, because otherwise your numbers won't line up, of course. So these are toggles to make these numbers line up. And then we also have a build multiplier here, which is, of course, since the medium maths we kind of discussed, it is actually a very interesting metric to have alongside of everything else. This, though, is specifically then here, the build multiplier isn't taking into account any, for instance, RPM changes, which, of course, Striker famously does have one. I'll just trust that you'll account for those yourself. We're just taking a multiplier from the stats down here, seeing as rate of fire isn't one of those stats because we're just inputting the RPM as it would be in from the game. That means that, yeah, we do want, we need to kind of watch out for stuff like that. Any multiplier that is outside of these, like the rate of fire, which is kind of applying to the RPM there, that's not going to be in here. But I feel it's still a useful tool to have alongside of here. And then what I especially added in to this as well, we have the rates, the system of rates that I kind of use. So we have headshot, we have DTOC, and we have armor rates, and we can set those, and then that will change the metrics up here without changing the numbers down here. So we can just input DTA and DTH as we normally would, and then these rates will affect them. That's also why there is a main one up here, which will set it for all. Or you can set it separately if you want to have, for instance, yeah, compare them at like 90 DTA or DTA rate, and then have a separate one with like 70 DTA rate. You can also just change the numbers down here. And then we have one little segment down here still. So we have a base damage calculator where we can back calculate to the base damage of our weapon. So there is a weapon damage stat in the game. I'll show that in a second. If we input that together with our all weapon damages and our specific weapon damages and our grading, we do get out a base damage that we can use for this. Usually though, what I use, and we'll use that throughout, is, and I'll link to the burst and sustain tables as well, is that I go to the burst and sustain tables, and from here, I grab the base damages. And then also for the skill ones, we recently added those into here as well. So you can grab the base damages from those for that calculator. So in here, for instance, we can come to here and grab, let's say, a Lexington, and then copy it from here. And that is actually how I generally grab my main metric, which is the base, because we do need that for our calculation in full. So we can input that as our first number here. And let's just start doing that. So going back into the game, yeah, the weapon damages, they come from here. So we already saw, yeah, we have 130 plus 30 basically. Now I am splitting it out for myself, that 130 at the top here, into grading and all weapon damage specifically. That is, yeah, you just have to get used to it, or you can put in 130 plus 30 and then just don't input anything into the grading, even though we have grading there, but the grading is already included in here. I want to still separate that out though, because I prefer having it like this. So, and it's my calculator, so I get to do what I want. Where we take the all weapon damage from the build, basically the grading is then separate to it. But of course, all of this section is adding all up together. It's just splitting it out here for easy changes and such, especially for instance, if I, for build showcases, want to change the grading, I can show that pretty easily. Next up, we have total weapon damage. Now, total weapon damage on the stat screen doesn't show up. There's nowhere here where it says total weapon damage. What you need to do is understand where total weapon damage can come from, and then is there any? So for instance, in this case, we do. Obliterate is total weapon damage. Most of the chest and backpack talents are generally total weapon damage. Vigilance, companion, focus, all of these things are total weapon damage. Now, total weapon damage is a different category than weapon damage. If you want to go and, yeah, kind of, if that is new to you or news to you, I would recommend going and watching or reading through the DPS calculation guide, which I'll link down below as well. I'll link to the guides folder, which will include that. So we have 20 total weapon damage here from Obliterate. Now it's asking us for our crit chances and crit damages. If we go into the game, we have a crit chance here with the modifier off specifically. Do always remember that if the modifier affects a thing, to, for instance, check for that, because especially if you check your stat screen, of course, and you have, for instance, it being modified by the modifier, then yeah, those are your metrics at that time only. So we have 51, 141, which is kind of the basis of these Obliterate strikers. But of course, what we also have is a coyote. So now we need to make a choice. The coyote, of course, at different ranges gives different bonuses. Do we want to include those? Do we want to exclude those? One will be active always, because from the very first shot that you do, you will activate one of these and one thing will be active at the very least. So generally you will have heard me say that I generally pick this 15 to 25 meters, for instance, for an AR build like this. And then for SMG builds, I usually pick the 0 to 15 or for shotgun builds. And that is an important thing, but of course this isn't included, unlike for instance the modifier, this isn't included actually in this crit chance and crit damage. So when we go back into our calculator here, we have to include those. Now, of course, there's a cap at 60, we have 51 plus 10, it still caps at 60 of course, so we have only 60. We'll put that in our 141 that we had in the game. That becomes then also a plus 10. We're getting plus 10, plus 10 if we're choosing to have kind of the coyote act in these calculations as if it's mid-range. So 151 there. Then if we go back to the game, headshot was the next metric it's asking for. All ARs base have, once you have the watchful, they have 75. So we have a 75 headshot. We'll add that in. We won't touch the headshot rate yet because we can, of course, as well, for the headshot and such, it is important to consider that you're not hitting 100% headshot, so we can't alter the rate. We won't do so yet. We'll do so in a second. Then it's asking for our damage to targets out of cover. Damage to targets out of cover, annoyingly as well, doesn't show up here in the stat screen. Only armor damage and health damage shows up here. But you need to just be aware where you could have some, and really only there is two places, which is Fox's Prayer, and then here the third stat of the weapon. Now, of course, as well, Smart Cover can provide some, so if you want to include that in that calculation, yeah, you're welcome to add in some of this ones. But mostly it's just the weapon and Fox's Prayer. We have it on the weapon, we have 10 DTOC on the weapon, so we will enter 10 DTOC. We won't touch the rate here either yet, and move on to DTA, DTH. As we already saw, those do show up in the stat screen, so we grab those from here. We just have 0 armor damage, 21 damage to health. Then that is, of course, coming from the AR itself, which has 21 as its class attribute, at least maxed out here. Then, do we have any further multipliers? So generally as well, I used to have these be amps. I'm going to use the terminology of multiplier from now on, just as a separate multiplier. I feel that causes less confusion, and actually I prefer that a lot to amp. And we do. And here, for instance, is where some game knowledge is required. Because if you've, for instance, interacted with my wrong text guides, you'll know that Striker, for instance, says weapon hits increase total weapon damage. That isn't true. This is basically a self-additive, multiplicative to everything else, separate multiplier. So Strikers with its stacks, and then here, of course, we have the backpack, taking it to basically being a 90% at 100 stacks. We need to deal with that as a separate multiplier, and we're doing so here. That's also why it's, of course, not going into the total weapon damage. It's going where it belongs. And this is the thing. At the end of the day, the arbiter, the final arbiter, is always the game. So when we take this number and add in, for instance, the 90 from the Striker, that's what we're adding here. We're getting now out a damage number, which we can check at, for instance, the range. But before we do, we should actually add in our weapon stats as well, of course. For it to spit out these numbers, it needs the full stats, which includes the weapon, of course. Now, in this case, we aren't comparing between weapons, but one of the things is that all of these cells are actually calculating in the same row. So if you change the number for a different weapon, so for instance, let's say on A, you have a Lexington, on B, you have a FAMAS, you could actually change this to, for instance, be 900 on that one, and that will cascade through and give you numbers for that. So you can input between weapons as well if you want to, but then you have to input them into here. Without doing that, if you're especially wanting to just compare builds, you can input them down here and it will fill them in all the way up there. We take these stats, of course, again, from in-game. So we have a Lexington here, so I have a 978 RPM, I have a 50 round mag, and then I have a 9.9 or 1.95 reload there. We take those metrics and put them into the game. So 978, 850 with a 15% rate of fire from the striker, of course, as 50 and 1.95. And that will just fill those in all the way up there. So if we're just taking one weapon, we just fill it in here and just fills it in for all of them. Now we have out a mag damage, we have a burst DPS, and we have a sustained DPS. Once we have these, we can already, of course, kind of see what these are, but of course, then we want to compare. But first, before we compare, that is what these numbers are for. Let's check. And for that, of course, we use this side piece here. And this is a very important thing to use, because if you don't line up with the game, as we said, the final arbiter is always the game. That's also, for instance, how we know that striker is a separate multiplier and not what the devs basically wrote down, but what the devs programmed is actually the important part. So we have, for instance, here a body shot and a body plus crit, and then a headshot and a headshot plus crit number. Now here, though, I'm going to, in the game in a second, shoot an health target. So we've set it at here at 5 meters incorrectly. We'll point that out right away just to show. And then we've set it to invulnerable there. And this target is there for us to shoot and check against. The range in general, outside of especially Dutch City, sometimes messes up a little, but the range can be a very useful tool for this kind of testing. Outside of this, I wouldn't really use the range for much, but you can definitely get correct numbers here. And we can also check that that is true if we go out in the in-game world, record ourselves at full stacks and see what is going. Because importantly, of course, here we are at full stacks. That's the metric that we've put in. Our multiplier for striker stacks is at full. One of the things, of course, here as well, that's nice from these calculators, we can just set this to 90 and then maybe at 45 and then maybe at 0 and see what our damage differences is. That's what these tools are actually there for. But you have to also remember those kinds of things. Now, we are shooting DTH, so I'm going to toggle the DTA off here and the DTH on here so that we are shooting the right thing, and then also DTOC. Now, we're getting two numbers out here, and one is this 384. The other is a 964, they're a little far away from me there. If we go take it to the game, we can just stack up to full and then start shooting. Of course, we want obliterate and striker to be at full stacks. That's the metrics that we will put in. Our coyote, though, is actually in the wrong range. But that means that if I'm shooting at this target, and I've swapped to killer here just so it doesn't activate. We, of course, aren't accounting for the weapon talent in here, but we could. So we're hitting for 384 at full stacks on our white damage, basically. If we kind of go back, 384 lines up. But our crit isn't this 964, because if we take it back into the game, and we can turn on damage numbers, and I should have actually, but we can see it through this as well as well. Stack up real quick again. Our crit number is a little bit higher than we are, so it's on a 1022. 101 is what we're hitting for crits wise there. And that, of course, isn't lining up with this 964, but that's, of course, we set our coyote at mid-range. So we need to match that. So if we take the coyote now to mid-range with that, and if I stack up my obliterate once again, and then we shoot 964, 464, in the game, 944, 462.5. And as we said, just because the base damages are, we don't know the full values of these, you will always have a little bit of discrepancy here, and especially some of the weapons more than others, because we're always at most 0.5 at largest, we're 0.5 away at it. And that does cascade through the whole calculation. But basically, if you're just one digit off, it's still perfectly fine. It's close enough for government work for an agent of the division. And once we have these checking numbers, and that's the important part, of course, we do need to match basically the game. And that's also the only way that, for instance, striker with this, we then know has to be basically this way. It will be a very weird coincidence if this is not lining up like that. And once we have that, we know for at least the bodies and the body plus crit, not per se yet for the headshot, because we might be off in our headshot numbers. So we would also want to check headshot. In here, though, I know it is 75, and that's just one metric, of course. So we don't need to per se, but definitely also always check your headshot, because you might have forgotten that you've put on, for instance, Providence or something, and you're at, instead of 75, you might be at 88 that it is nowadays. Now then, we can kind of look at our metrics. Now that we've input the build and we're confident that it is correct because we've checked, now we can play around. And this is where these tools really come in handy, I feel. So what we can do is, because we have these metrics and now we know that they line up, we can actually copy those metrics. So what if we take, for instance, this same build and then input it in down here. Now, one of the things to watch out for as we're copy and pasting, Control-C and Control-V, is we shouldn't copy the rates numbers here, as that will kind of actually break things. So we'll just copy everything besides those and just copy them over, and we can do so pretty quickly. Now we have the same numbers twice, as we're getting our mag damage out, our burst DPS, and our sustained DPS is out. And now, of course, we have the same numbers, but for instance, we have that coyote in there, right? So what if we now, for instance, want to know the numbers for the other coyote range, for being, for instance, close range? So the base build is 51, 141. So we'll do 51, and then actually one of the important things, and this is actually a handy thing to get into, is to just generally let the spreadsheet that can do calculations perfectly do the calculations perfectly. So this is 141 plus 25, which is 166. I can do that in my head pretty quickly, but I might get it wrong once. And especially if I'm doing, as you may have seen, several of these multi-calculators in a row or something, I might make a mistake there. Might as well just let the spreadsheet do the work there and input it into there as a calculation. So is 141 plus 25, and we get out this 166. Now we have basically the coyote on this build at the mid-range, at full stacks on everything at the mid-range, and then at close range. So if we're basically in the wrong range, so to say. We can see that on the burst DPS, we're losing a little bit. It's going to metric through everything basically at the same rate. So we're just losing average shot here. So that means that actually all of these numbers are going down by the same amount, as it isn't affecting something like if our RPM or something changes. That would affect the sustain calculation side of things as well. But here the burst and sustain are going down by the same amount. So we have here 2 and a little bit % less damage when we lose that coyote. And we can, of course, do this in multiple ways as more, for instance, as well. If we take this, and we don't need to do them per se side by side. So I'm going to put this one a little bit lower, and you may have seen this as well in a lot of the in-depth looks and such. I like spreading them out, just so we, for instance, on this one, we go to having 45 stacks. And then maybe let's do the same once more as we put it down here, and add 0 stacks for striker. And then maybe at the 0 stacks for striker, we also remove the stacks for obliterate. And now, for instance, we know that when we don't have stacks, especially when we have no stacks at all, we're dropping off a lot of damage on the striker. And that's, of course, yeah, it's a stacking build. So these kind of metrics and knowing these kind of numbers and how much difference they make, that is actually the true strength of these multi-calculators. Just seeing things side by side, the human brain is much better at contrasting things towards each other instead of just trying to remember, oh, this build is 12.8 million and this build is 11.6 million or stuff like that. I don't remember that kind of stuff at all myself. We just compare and contrast, and especially boiling it down to a percentage. A percentage is much easier to understand than just looking at this number and going like, oh, this number is much bigger than that number. Knowing a percentage point difference between things is actually, that makes it, at least to my brain, a lot clearer. Now as well, the one thing we can play with as well is, for instance, if we had, let's say, a different weapon on the second one, we would input, for instance, the base damage from the other one, and let's maybe actually do that here. So let's say instead we want to go to a weapon, and we'll just make one up Doesn't need to be real, so we're making basically a new one down here as well to compare against. And let's say on this weapon we have a base damage of, let's say, 60,000, just a number that I'm pulling straight out of my backside. And let's say we have 700 RPM. How would that actually look? Okay, so maybe we go with 800 RPM. So if this weapon existed with 60,000 base damage with the same, all the other stats being the exact same, basically, 800 RPM would not be enough for it to beat this weapon. So that is, for instance, showing differences there. And yeah, we can use this, of course, by taking just actual base damages from the burst and sustain tables and those RPMs alongside of it. Do keep in mind that you do need to, if you're taking it from the base tables, strikers is going on top. So this would be, for instance, this 800 would be theoretically a number including strikers. And yeah, you need to do it right that way. And then we can, for instance, compare that. Oh, that weapon would, at least on a burst and a sustained DPS sense, be a better choice or a worse choice or whatever it may show. That doesn't, of course, include that strikers is, for instance, a stacking build. So even if this was, let's put this to something, although if it was too insane, we still would. But let's maybe put this to 7,000. That's 700,000. It's a little bit more. Let's say we have this 7,000 or 70,000 base there. We're lining up a little closer, but then the RPM of this would still be worse, so we kind of need to include those kind of things. At the end of the day, always, all of these DPS calculations and such are, first of all, theoreticals. Secondly, they don't include the entire story. So you need game experience on top to analyze and discuss this in depth. The place where burst DPS calculations and sustained DPS calculation really shine is especially, for instance, in things like this. Simple changes, but especially knowing that, like, when you're in the right range versus the wrong range in the coyote, how much difference it makes. Or, for instance, as we have it here, how much difference does it make if we have a Grupo chest instead of a Cheska chest? And why do we go with a Cheska chest? You can calculate both of them out and see that the Cheska chest is basically always ahead. So why not, right? Even though in that case it's a tiny margin, but you might as well go with the better margin there. DPS, the more varied the builds are versus each other, the more you have to actually account for that. This is, of course, the same thing as in just general science. When we're doing hard sciences and we're doing metrics, differences and such, you can be very precise. When we're doing sociology, you have to kind of be, include a lot of things about humans and how they work and just quirks of them. Here as well, if we're comparing a striker versus a negotiator, just looking at the DPS isn't the answer. You have to also understand the underlying mechanics. Let's start moving towards the next one. And let's go on to the Headhunter one. And we'll be a lot briefer here. For a kind of more in-depth one, yeah, the DPS one I kind of went in-depth into. Here we'll just be sticking to kind of the basics. So again, we'll be taking the base, and we'll be doing so here as well from just the burst and sustain tables, as I'll go over there. We're going to go to pistols. I'm going to grab the Regulus base here, as that's the weapon we'll be using in a second. And that's the easiest way, again, to just get to the base numbers here. If we go back to the Headhunter here and zoom in again, I'm going to just input that into that field. So that is our base. Now here, as the build that we'll be comparing with, I have just the Headhunter's Fury here with a DNH backpack and a chainkiller chest. Kind of a general setup for this. Now we're going to include here the Hunter's Fury just because I also want to show that Hunter's Fury is a little bit odd in the Headhunter calculation. And because of that needs its own thing there. But one of the things that we have here is we have actually for perfect and normal Headhunter, because that's the two options for the Headhunter here. I just decided to just make this a toggle. Now you can actually toggle both, and that gives you 275. Now I would hope, again, that you just remember to just only toggle one at a time. And if you have different ones as well, if you want to compare a normal Headhunter versus a perfect Headhunter, so for instance, what if we, instead of that chainkiller, maybe put something else, we would just alter the numbers down here. But here, just in case we're just comparing everything of kind of the same ilk, so everything as chain killer, we'll just toggle that 150 there, and I'll fill in 150 into all of these. Again, all weapon damage and such. We'll go into the game, we'll look at our metrics. Now here, we do need to switch weapon, of course. You can do so by just clicking this on PC. It is also, you know, it says G, so I'm assuming on console it'll say a button there. And yeah, if we hit that button, we go all the way until we hit the pistol, because we need to be on the right weapon here, of course. And yeah, the pistol is a little bit deeper in. Now we have 135 all weapon damage bonus, and then we have a further 50 pistol. Now here again, and yeah, this is just the way I'm going to keep it, and you have to kind of remember it. Either you put in 135 as we had there, and then 50, and then you leave the grade empty, because the grade would be basically on top. Because the grade is, of course, already included in this. But what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to split this up into 105 and 30, just because I know 105 is coming from the build, because that first piece, Walker and Harris, is getting us to that 105. Normally, most builds have 100 if they're all red, without any outside sources. But then here with the chain killer, of course, being that first piece, we get that in. Then total weapon damage again. Total weapon damage is not shown in the stat screen, but we can kind of deduce how much we have. In this case, it's just vigilance, so a 25. Let's go back in, put in 25. Now, DTA or DTH, this one does show up on the stat screen, but we have none of it as on, well, actually, we do have, of course, here, for instance, it's showing with the shotgun, but again, we need to go to the pistol where we have none of it. That 12% it was there showing from the shotgun. So again, as always, make sure that you line up your stats with in-game. That is actually the biggest issue that most people cause for themselves, is just to not line up there. So we're just not gonna have these active. And then also on top of that, one thing you can do for builds that do have it, you can actually have, for instance, let's say we have that and that, wouldn't even be realistic numbers actually to have. You can, for the calculation, activate and deactivate them separately. Just so you can toggle between them easily without inputting or having to remove the number and re-input it. You can just activate this entire column by itself. Then we need of course, our headshot stat. And for that, we go back into the game and take our headshot stat here, which is with the pistol, again, 121 or 210. And we do have 10 DTOC. Again, DTOC does not show up in the game. You need to know that you have it. The weapon and Fox's Prayer is really the two main sources of it anyway. So with this all in, we basically have our numbers already. So this is the build as is, except of course, yeah, we were talking about having Hunter's Fury. Now, Hunter's Fury has its own segment here, and we can make use of that. And we'll have to, because we're using, of course, a Hunter's Fury setup again. And that bonus, that range bonus that it has, this enemies within 50 meters, that debuff actually does double dip in the second shot onwards. So it is actually in the main shot, it is getting copied as the stored amount. Together with that, on the stored amount, it is adding in another 20%. And then also it is going into the headhunter calculation, giving us another 20% in there. Because especially to point out here as well, the headhunter calculation, and that's also why this is laid out the way that it is, in a different order than the DPS one. Everything from this base all the way to the end of DTH here is actually included in the headhunter calculation, and then everything beyond it isn't, generally, except of course then again the the Hunter's Fury section here is then again included. And in this way as well, so normally with a lot of builds, yeah, a lot of their multipliers and such isn't actually included in, especially for instance, how much the cap shot would be. In the case of Hunter's Fury, though, it is special and unique, and because of that, we need to treat it as such. So if we are having the mark on the enemies when we're killing them, so for instance, here in the range, we'll be doing that. If we are within that 50 meters, we need to basically toggle this on and have this 20 meters be on in there. Then also we have the stacking buff, that stacking buff of Hunter's Fury. And that killing a debuffed enemy this stacking amplified damage, separate multiplier basically, is a self-stacking multiplier, so, or a self-multiplicative multiplier basically. And in such, it is actually not, it isn't 25% at 5 stacks. That's why I made a little drop-down menu here where you can put it, for instance, to 5 stacks, where we have a 27.63 and then several other digits behind it. So this just to simplify actually calculating that out. We're going to keep it at 0 stacks here for this moment, because again, instead of the checking numbers on the side, though in this case, we of course now have the main numbers. This is predicting our hits basically. So we now have our base number and there its percentages at the first shot, the second shot, the third shot, and the cap shot, and how much the percentages would be if we had anything to compare them against. But let's first, again, check. As with these given metrics, we should hit this 4,111,975 that we're here. Although within Headhunter, as we were talking about, again, with the bases not being perfectly known to us, we will be off by a little bit. In headhunting calculations, being off by 2 digits is still within the realm of reason, usually below at least 20, even with cap shot numbers. Anything over 2 digits, so if you're 3 digits off, generally there is a mistake. But here we can now go and check. So basically we'll consider that 4111, and then the rest of it, well, yeah, we'll double check and see if we're close enough. But yeah, 4111, right? Now, one thing to keep in mind is especially this number here that is shown, especially for instance here, we're going to shoot a red in a second. This number is basically the health value that this enemy had, or health and armor value that this enemy had. So even if we go over it, we won't see it there. So you shouldn't ever use that number when you're doing headhunter numbers. What you have to do is use your, either record it and then have that damage number pop up, or of course on PC, what we can do is turn on damage numbers and have it be in the chat here. Now here we have it set up. Let's actually take our shot, and as long as it isn't a crit, hopefully we'll have our damage number there. So it is kind of behind my head, but it is a 4111973. So that 4111 is already lining up. Let's see if that 973 is close enough. 975. We're 2 off, 1 digit error. Yeah, that's fine. And that is then our hit there. Let's take it to the second shot. And then especially in the second shot, of course, one of the things would be that we have our the Hunter's Fury debuff. So again, I'm going to take that first shot. But here we have, and it is the same number again, which it should be very consistent, but we have actually 1 stack of Hunter's Fury there. So actually, if we want to test it as the metrics that we have set without Hunter's Fury stack, we wait for the Hunter's Fury stack to fall away. That's 10 seconds. The Headhunter is 30 seconds, so we have 20 seconds basically to take that second shot. So we got a second shot there, and actually let's take that third shot as well. But again, waiting for the Hunter's Fury to fade away, because otherwise our metrics don't line up. We could set up the calculator in a way where it goes, adds in an extra damages for those stacks in there, but just for ease of use, we just don't. We critted there, but that would also have been our cap shot anyway. So we're going to retake that shot. I'm going to wait for the Headhunter or for the Hunter's Fury stack to fall away. On the buff bar, our Headhunter icon is gone, but yeah, it's still there. So we have a 19.185 as our cap without critting. And if we take that back, so that 11.51.3 as that second shot, just next to my ear there, and the last 3 digits are 526. So here 530. So 4 off, still 1 digit. It's perfectly fine. And if we then take it to the cap shot, which as well, if the cap shot is above the third shot is the same as the cap shot, actually this calculator will not spit out a wrong value there, because then the cap shot and the third shot are basically the same. Because the third shot could, if you're just calculating it in cascade basically without checking if it's higher than this number, would actually be higher than the cap, but then of course that would not be a real or usable number. Sometimes there is a third shot that isn't at the cap, but that would be basically, that would never be the case with Chain Killer in there, nor with the Undus Fury buff. And our cap shot being, how much was it in here? 185, 188. So 19, 185, 198. So here we're the first time off by a second digit, but still within 10 basically. And that's perfectly fine. And these numbers are then usable, and then we can just, if we want to change things about the build, hey, how hard does this hit without 30 grading? We could just remove the grading, for instance, and then have those metrics. And that is especially the use case for these. Here as well, actually, we even can use this, because one of the metrics that we haven't inputted, and it is optional, you don't need to do this, and that's also why it's generally inactive to start with, is crit damage here. So we can actually go into the game and grab our crit damage for the pistol, which is a whopping 45 there, as we have it. And if we take that into here as well, we can actually input 45 and then active. Now, actually, on the cap shot there, and this is just, if we, for instance, on the first shot were to crit, we would have this metric. You would need to, for this crit to actually line up all the way, for instance, to the third shot and stuff, it would need to be 3 crits in a row, which, of course, with the 10% crit chance that we have there, that's never going to happen. But we can actually use this as well for the cap shot there. So we did actually crit on the cap shot, right? So 19782. We take this into the game here and pull up our chat numbers again. 19782,088, and then in the spreadsheet it is an 097. So we're off a little bit there but we're still within 3 digits of it. And yeah, you can use this. It doesn't per se need it, but just if in case you want to know what your crit hit alongside of everything else would be. Then also lastly, we have this hot shot second shot. As of course with hot shot, the second shot would be bonus by that amplifier that it has, that separate multiplier. And in doing so, yeah, it is actually handy to have this as a toggle if you're doing a hot shot build, because then you can line up just inputting your stats. You would need this basically to make it line up. The second shot would be bonused by hot shot in that way if you're just from a standstill. If you want all of your numbers to be with the hot shot, so for instance, if you're kind of, you've already done 4 shots and then you're kind of cycling within that buff as it works as well, you would just input it down here as 20% and not toggle this. This is only if you're doing from a standstill, basically no buffs are active. Your first shot would just be that one, but your second shot would be bonus by hot shot. So this toggle just adds in an extra 20%, but only on the second shot. And for that, yeah, it can be useful, and just use it for when you are running hot shot and you want your calculations there to match up. The rest of this is then, yeah, pretty clear as was. We can, of course, in the same way, input multiple builds. So for instance, as well, if we took the same metrics here that we have, and then, well, let's maybe not take the crit there, but if we went from that one to this one and made a copy of it, they of course line up. But let's say now, hey, it's 2027, 60 grading is here. For some reason, I hope not. I hope they cap it at some point. But let's say we had 60 grading. Oh, we would hit these numbers, right? So we can play around with these. And that is actually the true use case for this. Or for instance, hey, what does a 0 graded version versus that one do? And we can get the numbers out without actually having those items. And that's the strength of all these multi-calculators. Let's go on and look at that last. As lastly, but not leastly, we have the skill damage calculator, multi-calculator. In this one, it is a little bit different, as we are kind of doing it in the same way. Layout-wise, it's very similar, but we're getting out different things here. So we are getting a damage number out. This is basically without any DTA or damage targets out of cover included into it, which is especially there for skills like the ballistic skills, which is the turret, the drone, sniper turret, and such. Those aren't affected by damage to armor, which most other skills are. And you can find graphics and such explaining these in full, which skills are and aren't affected. But most of the explosive skills and such are affected by damage to armor. The Oxy and the Demolisher Firefly are affected also by damage to targets out of cover. And that also means that for those two skills, we kind of need to have, as they are also affected by damage to armor, we need to have the combined version of those. But especially the DTOC and the DTA plus DTOC is only there for the Demolish Firefighter, but also the Oxy. And the Oxidizer is an important enough skill that we kind of need to have this section. So we do need to know which parts we can look at. This doesn't in any way kind of allude to if the skill will have that. But you can, of course, check it with it. The point is to check it against the game as well. For the bases, let's actually go over to the burst and sustain tables, where there is actually now a tab in there with the base stats for the skills. Now, if we take, for instance, out of here, the assault turret, we'll take that just to show the full functionality of this multi-calculator. We'll go back here and put that in the base slot as we have there. Now, with the skills and such, you do need to be aware that, yeah, the places where the stats come from is a little bit different, of course. In this case, we're also pooling them kind of together, but also splitting them up. So, for instance, all of this would be the skill damage pool, but I'm kind of splitting up into a watch, into a stat, into brands, into tech from technician, and weapon talent. I'm doing so just for clarity, because splitting them up like this is much more easily noticeable if I'm missing something. This would all pool together. You could just input, and you could also do that here. If you know the number for all of it together is, let's say, 100, you could just do that and leave the rest empty. I like splitting it up in this way because I can very easily find if I have a mistake, where that mistake is. Here as well, tiers, mods, and grading go into a pool together here, which I'm calling just the damage multiplier. And then the skill damage multiplier is basically everything in that. Let's already look at, for instance, and I'm grabbing actually a weird build, but it'll make sense a little bit later. I'm grabbing an Oxy build, and we're going to put a turret on this, which is not a normal thing to do, but just for the metrics here. So on this, I will also put a mod, a 5 damage mod that we have there. And we're going to take these metrics as they are then. So we have, as we saw there, we have the tiers. So the tiers are just at skill tier 6 that we are here. It shows 100 plus 120% damage. So that is that tier number. And all of the skills generally have, by their tiers, gain some damage, especially if they're a damage dealing skill. Then we have a mod. We saw that was a 5%. And then I have my turrets graded to 25. So that is the 3 metrics that we have there. And we can take all 3 of them from here. Just the damage there, the mod is here, and the expertise is here. Then we go to the watch. Now, in this case, of course, on the watch, if you are at above 1,000, you will have filled in this one. I definitely know where skill damage is here. Yes, and it is a 10% basically that we gain from there. That is just going into that same stat pool there. So 10 from watch. Then we have stats. Now stats is just attributes from the build, not the brands. We're splitting it out into brands and stats just for a little bit more clarity, but we'll just count these. So we have 1, we have 2, we have 3, and then we have 4 skill damage, 5 skill damage, 6 skill damage. So we have 60 from stats. So that's 60. Next, off of brands. Now the brands, of course, you kind of just need to check and make sure that you are attributing them correctly. Here we have skill damage and also skill efficiency. Skill efficiency is a 1-to-1 also into skill damage. So the Empress here, the 3-piece, that's already 18 skill damage. And then together with that, another 8, making for 26 skill damage from brand bonuses. We'll add that into here. I am running Technician. Technician is a further 10 into that if you are, if your points are going into that choice, because you can actually choose to go with repair skill, of course. And then also web talent. Now, in this case, I'm going to leave out web talent. We can add that in, for instance, if our in sync is active or if we're running capacitor, we can add that into that pool as well. Here, though, we'll just leave it out and we'll just not shoot. Then total skill damage, that is just, of course, from, again, in the same way that total weapon damage works from things like talents and such. Here we have 25% on kill from whenever we do get a kill with our skills going into there. And this is 25% just total skill damage. So it is a separate multiplier, and we'll add it in as 25%. Now, in this case, for the turret and drone, the DTA, DTOC, and such would not apply at all. So we're going to leave those empty, but we're going to go into having glass here, which is a separate multiplier, 25% on top of everything else. So let's make sure we account for that. When we do, I already see a number up there. We have put in all of the stats that we kind of feel are relevant. Let's go see if we can check that. As with always, if it doesn't line up with the game, the calculation has no value. We can only take the damage here. We can't look at DTA, we can't look at DTOC or such, even though, for instance, on this build, we do have 8 DTA. We do have actually as well, actually when I'm holding the shotgun, we have even 20 DTA. And here as well, we have further 18 damage to targets out of cover on the build itself, actually, because we have a Fox's Prayer plus the DTOC from the shotgun and the DTA here from the contractors, and then the shotgun again as well. We can't include those. Those don't apply to the skill. So while we could input them in here, we just shouldn't look at these numbers. And that's just something that you need to learn and do. It needs to be applicable to the skill for it to matter to it. With the ballistic skills, and that's also why we took this here, we're just getting this base number. So we could just leave those empty because, yeah, they don't do anything for our number here. But actually we can, for instance, in a second, we'll also do the oxy, and then, of course, they do matter. So 213, 604. Now, if we go into the game and I equip the turret and just let it go to town on this enemy, we see first is 170 there. That is, of course, before tech support is up. And then once we have tech support triggered, which is a metric that we have input, we're hitting 213, 602. So we're off by just 2, as we are 604 down here. And that is, yeah, again, we don't have the perfect base numbers here, and because of that, it's cascading through. But close enough, and definitely enough for us to, for instance, then go and, again, we can copy all of this. Here we have no rates and stuff even in between, so we can actually copy all of this all over. And then let's say we are in the far-flung future, and we have, again, 60 grading. How much difference would that make? Well, 14% on top of the 25 that I have here. But as well, for instance, of course, very handy to know, 0 versus 30. For instance, here though, we can't of course check anymore because I don't have the skills at those, but we know that the metrics are correct. So now changing one metric, we can be pretty confident that we're doing it fine. And yeah, if we had 0 and we had 30, we're gaining 13% on the turret and drone, which, yeah, is a decent amount for a grade 30 at great expense, of course. But yeah, eventually I'll take my turret and drone to that to that number. For the time being, they're on 25. And that's the numbers we're aiming for, which is still an 11%. And this is the kind of handiness that these multi-calculators can bring. Then we also have the burst and sustain section. This is only really for the assault drone and the assault turret, or well, the striker drone and the assault turret. We can toggle this on. I have it toggled off by default just so it doesn't show up and people kind of look at it and go like, oh, this is my burst DPS with oxy, which doesn't make sense at all as a metric. But for the turret and drone, it kind of does. We know 750 RPM, we know 1 second reload, so we're inputting those into here and a 30 round mag. So it is basically using those metrics, and then and that's the same for the turret and the drone, so we can use that for both of them, and we can get a burst and sustain DPS out of those. And we can see that even on a skill build like this, which is, reaching decently high numbers, yeah, these are not together, it's just 3 million DPS basically combined, maybe a little bit more, let's call it 4 million. That isn't a lot, and of course then the weapon of the build kind of comes on top, but that might be just in the further 3 or so, and that's why, yeah, scale builds can't directly compete with some of the red builds, but they can of course have other benefits. Now, what we can do as well is we have these metrics, and let's take them and actually just do the oxy as well. And for that, I've copied over the rows up here, these two down to here, as beyond this line basically is the build. Before this line, it's the skill. So if we're swapping out skill, so here we're going, for instance, to an Oxy, we just can reuse the numbers that we had from the build and then just change out the skill. So let's go take the base damage from the Oxy again. So that is this 53090 from this list. We'll take that back here and we'll put it in both rows. And then we need to, again, go into the game and, of course, look at the actual skill, because the mods and such, and also how much we get from tiers might be different, and it is. So in this case, we're getting at skill tier 6, we're getting 60 skill damage, or 60 damage, specifically not skill damage. Expertise is giving us 25, so we're grade 25 on there, and we have a 5% mod in here. So we need to use these numbers, of course, for these parts. So yeah, it's instead 60, and then yeah, same 5, and then 25. And we're going to do them on both. And then actually on this one, for instance, we're going to do it before and after we trigger our tech support, which is 25 total skill damage. So if we put 1 to 0 and 1 to 25, and if we're shooting at an enemy in a second that it doesn't have armor, for instance, we're going to have ourselves these two numbers. So we're not looking at the DTA numbers or the DTA plus DTOC numbers. We're just looking at the DTOC numbers here. So 306 for 9 something for the before we trigger our tech support, as I had to recollect what it was there. And then afterwards, we would hit 383, basically. Let's see how we actually do. Of course, I haven't actually looked per se well yet. And one of the things is, when we have the shotgun, for instance, you see there, we're not hitting for, well, 383 that we would hit now after tech support is active. That is only active when I'm holding the shotgun, because we have to actively hold the shotgun. Well, for talents and such, it is transitive. These stats are not. So for this 12 damage to armor, for this 10% DTOC, you need to actively be holding the shotgun. And this is those kind of things that you have to watch out for when you're filling these in. So we're going to go back to having our shotgun in our hand, 383119 after tech support is active. And yeah, 383120. So we're off by 1 basically, and that is perfectly fine. And actually before tech support went in, we also saw 306 for something. So yeah, we're lining up there, and that's of course always the thing to check. And now we can play around and maybe even theory craft other builds. Hey, what happens if we from this build move to, for instance, having also in sync up, and then we can add in the 30 skill damage that you would get from that being active, and just, you know, refine it more and more as we need to, and then also of course contrast and compare. But one of the things to remember is that, yeah, these are two different, these work in completely different ways. This is basically ticking twice a second. This thing is firing at 750 RPM. You can't compare them, especially on DPSs and such. But you can, of course, you could metric it out even further by just, yeah, twice per second of this, but you could maybe put out like 6 or 7 oxys. And then, of course, 750 RPM divided by 60, you can get a rounds per second out and such, and kind of compare them in that way. But then still, they work quite differently, because the turret might miss, the oxy is just an area thing and people might get out of it, or also people might be kept into it and you might hit multiple enemies. So again, a lot of caveats, the same as with builds, the same as with headhunters and such. There are a lot of caveats to account for, but that's, yeah, that's just beyond the capabilities of this. I'll trust that whoever is using them actually uses them in good faith and actually tries to do good with them. But yeah, let's look one last thing. As one last thing I want to showcase here briefly, as this is also a very handy tool. It's the quick calcs. It's in that same folder. This can also be used to compare things against each other and even doing so faster. So this is a bunch of just simple calculators that do different things. So on this first one, we have basically the same compare calculation, but just going off of other metrics. So instead of going off of all of the stats of the build, which is my preferred way of doing so, because then also I can, as we showed, play with the stats. What if I, you know, swap this piece out for that piece or such? Here, we're just taking the numbers, the damage hits of the game, taking a non-crit and a crit, and then inputting our crit chance as well into here, and this way just getting out the DPS. So it is a very quick way of getting the DPS of a build, especially if you're considering just, you have 2 builds already built, you have them in the game, you can, just pull out the damage numbers out right away. This would be the faster way of doing so. And you can, just fill in this one, fill in the non-crit, fill in the crit. If you want it to be headshot numbers, you do the non-crit headshot, the crit headshot, and then the crit value, and then it spits out basically an average number. And together with that, of course, you do need to fill in the same weapon stats here as well. So it is just going off of those metrics, calculating out the average shot that way, in the same way that we kind of laid out in the simple calcs video. Then we also have a crit chance balancer, crit chance, crit damage balancing tool, where you basically put in your crit chance, your crit damage. It spits out a number, and bigger number wins. And in this way as well, we're actually spitting out the crit damage multiplier. That's also why it starts on 1, basically, independent of what numbers you have in here already. And you can just basically fill in, for instance, in this case, we have a actual case that we used in the medium maths of that 57 and 142 versus 60 and 130. And in this case, of course, we would be basically wasting 3 if we're doing this, for instance, with one of the attributes on the build. And is that worth it? And we can basically say no, because bigger number wins here, at least from a purely DPS metric. Because again, here, for instance, if we're running killer, is that 60 better than that 57? It depends, because it kind of depends how big of a gap it is here, of course, as well. Then also we have a quick shot calculator. So basically this is not the average shot, but just a pure shot. So if you put in, for instance, in this case, I've gone in and put in just the metrics and then what number we would hit. And then here I have it basically with and without crit. And that's basically the same numbers that we have up here. And it's actually from an old build, because 44191 was the old FAMAS numbers, but I'm just keeping these numbers in here. They don't have to be real. So just as an example, just to show where they go in. And then you can basically just fill in numbers and get what you should hit for in the game for. So with this, you could use these to get to a number as well, and then fill it up in upstairs. But though, of course, the multi-calculators kind of build that into one go. Also, you can calculate out an average shot in this same way with this calculator. And then also the base calculator as well here split out into its own thing. But especially this main one, where you can just input numbers from in the game, and from that very quickly get a burst and sustain DPS out of it, is a very handy way. And actually the thing I would recommend doing instead of ever using range DPS numbers, as the range is really bad at spitting out an actual correct DPS number much more easily. Even if you don't want to input the whole build, just input your non-crit, your crit chance, and it'll spit, and you would need your weapon stats as well. But then it would spit out a burst and sustain DPS number for you. And that brings us to the end of these, as that then brings us to the conclusion of this pretty long video in the end. I wanted to make it a little bit shorter, but we had to kind of go in depth. If we're gonna make kind of a manual for these things, we kind of need to go as in-depth as I did here. And of course, there's 3 of them. I should have maybe split it up into 3 different ones. But in the end, we'll go with all 3 all together. And I hope you did enjoy coming along with me in explaining how all of these work and looking at their new fresh coats of paints. And these multi-calculators are basically a core to what I need to do what I do. So I made them a very long time ago, and we've just been chipping away at them and improving them here and there wherever we can. And this is the latest iteration of them for so far. And I hope in showing you how to use them, that they are clear enough for anybody else to use. Just copy them or download them, and then you can fill them in, and they are very useful tools. As well, DPS isn't everything. It is one of the big parts of any story. It is basically the horsepower, if we're kind of comparing it into, or if we're taking it into a car analogy. It is a very important metric. It's not the end all be all, but you always want to know it, basically. And that's why every racing game ever will actually spit out the horsepower of a car and alongside of all the other metrics. It's not that the other metrics don't matter. It's just that this one is really, truly very important to tell a whole story. And yeah, that then brings us to the end of this video. I hope you did enjoy it. If you did, please do. And all of the algorithm things down below, as it does help out. So I'll do that a little bit of shilling here. For future videos, we are going to go into that expose that I was talking about. But also, of course, actually, I want to get back into doing some more division stuff and not be held up by that for too long. So we'll go into the Eclipse Masterclass shortly following that. So yeah, I hope you join me for those. And as always, have a good night.